First of all, I want to thank Susan Yuqing Feng. I want to thank the China Institute for having me here. For someone in my profession, you know, this is like a country singer singing the Grand Ole Opry, right? This is it. You know you've made it when they've asked you to speak at the China Institute. And thank you all so much for coming. This is such a wonderful turnout. You know, writing is lonely work. I worked on the book for 16 years, and it's wonderful to have this opportunity to share it with so many people. So thank you so much for coming out. So I'm going to just do a very brief presentation to begin, and I'll apologize right off the bat. I mean, I've been giving this presentation to other audiences. I suspect this audience may be a little bit more you know, seasoned or knowledgeable about the subject than some of the other audiences. So I'm not trying to insult anyone's intelligence here. I'm not trying to patronize you, but I'm, you know, in a group this large, it's hard to know, you know, if everyone's on the same page. So I'm just going to begin talking very generally about what the subject of the book is, why I felt it was important to write, why I felt it was a book that English language readers needed. So, you know, you see my title, To Rule All Under Heaven. Originally, this was my original subtitle, A History of China's Warring States Period. And when I posed that to my editor, he said, well, if we make that the subtitle, no one in America will know what the book is about, right? Which, you know, again, is kind of odd, right? From the perspective of people living in China, saying that someone doesn't know, has never heard of the Warring States Period here in the United States, it's like saying someone's never heard of the American Revolution or the Civil War, right? It's a very seminal moment in the history of China. So one of the reasons, really one of my objects, and I will feel that I've succeeded in writing the book, is just to sort of up the ratio of people who've heard of the Warring States period here in the English-speaking world. Why write a book about the Warring States period? Okay. So the Warring, well, first of all, I guess the way I always begin this presentation is by saying, well, what is the Warring States period? What do we mean by the Warring States? And, you know, again, for most American audiences, the best place to begin is in both time and space, in geography and chronology. So geographically, you can see the Warring States, the 7 great Warring States, and it, you know, I commissioned a very detailed, sort of very historically accurate map. It can be kind of hard to discern how many different Warring States, but the 7 great Warring States, they occupied this region of what's today the People's Republic of China, right? So generally centered on the North China Plain, the kind of heart, the center of the action was the Yellow River Valley, but it extended down into the Yangtze River Valley and the valley of the Yangtze River tributaries. And it was an expanding sphere of action. The Warring States, as I defined it, went on for about 260 years. And over the course of those 260 years, this maelstrom of activity, of violence and political sort of turmoil grew wider and wider and extended through an ever-widening area, centering on the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. When did this all go on? It went on, you know, in absolute terms, in the terms of the timeline of China. All the Warring States, almost all of it falls within what's called the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou kings, their reign began in about 1045 BC. They overthrew a prior dynasty of kings, the Shang dynasty. The Zhou dynasty is the longest ruling dynasty in Chinese history. They ruled for about 800 years. And they had an enormous mystique in their own time. And even today, you know, in the sort of historical memory and the historical imagination of Chinese people, the Zhou is kind of, it almost has the status of like biblical times, right? It's a period in which many of the sort of seminal foundational events of Chinese culture took place, and many of the foundational norms of Chinese, the Chinese ethos were sort of established. The Zhou, because it was such a long dynasty, you can see it gets subdivided So when the Zhou first took over in 1045, this is around the same time that King David was founding his dynasty in ancient Israel. The Zhou kings were very powerful. They remained very powerful pretty much down until about 771 BC. In 771 BC, they suffered this catastrophe. They were driven out of their original western capital by an inner Asian people known as the Xianyuan. And they were forced, you see in this map, I'll go back to my original map. You can see where the Zhou kings lived. They live in this little state surrounded by their vassals. Originally, their capital was out here in the Wei River Valley. And they controlled the entire Wei River Valley, which enabled them to field very large armies, which they could use to chastise and keep in line all of these vassals who lived in the east. But once they were moved into this small base area in the middle of all of their vassals, they really became militarily very, very weak. They really couldn't exert any kind of material control over their vassals. They still had enormous cultural prestige. They claimed to have the mandate of heaven. The Zhou king, he was the only person who could use the title of king, and he was the only person who had the title son of heaven, which marked him as a sort of singular intermediary between the human world and the gods. And so he had, a kind of enormous religious prestige, but he didn't really have much material power with which to control these regional rulers. These regional rulers had all originally been appointed by the founding kings of the Zhou dynasty. But they even in the early decades of the Zhou, they had kind of slipped a little bit beyond the control of the Zhou kings. They began to fight with one another, to sort of conquer and annex one another. By the time we get to the middle of this period, this map shows the state of affairs in 350 BC. The number of regional lords had gone from being over 100, right? There were more than 100 of these regional states to, just over maybe between 15 and 20, of which 7 giant states were the clear superpowers. And they were all squared off against one another. The situation of 350 BC, we think of China as a single polity, but in 350 BC, the political situation of China resembled post-Westphalian Europe more than the current People's Republic of China. It was divided between these 7 autonomous, very technologically sophisticated sovereign powers who were in a state of constant, really total war with one another. And that situation persisted all the way down to 221 BC, when, spoiler alert for those of you who are thinking of buying the book, this western kingdom of Qin conquered the other 6 great states and founded the unified Qin dynasty. And that's where we get the name China from, right? That's why the unified polity of China is called China, because it was during the Qin dynasty that Latin speakers first learned of this great empire in the East and named it China or Shina, right? That situates us in sort of geography and in sort of the political geography. In terms of time, I begin the book, and I know Susan is going to ask me about this, in 481 BC with this event in the eastern state of Qi. That is virtually simultaneous with the Battle of Thermopylae. The Battle of Thermopylae took place in 480 BC. It was one of the opening battles of the Second Persian War. And so, these 2 periods in ancient history, the Warring States, the Persian Wars, the era of sort of Periclean Athens, Socratic Athens, they play similar roles in the historical imagination of Chinese and European and American society, respectively. So, if we look at popular culture here in the United States, the Battle of Thermopylae, if people have heard of it, it's probably because of this, this movie 300, right, based on a graphic novel. So we know that the Battle of Thermopylae is very important because it gave us the six-pack ab, right? But in similar terms, in the same way that these very dramatic events happening in ancient Greece provide us with images and stories that are commemorated in popular culture, if you go to China, the same thing is true about the Warring States. The Warring States plays the same role in China's popular imagination as ancient Greek and Roman times do here in the United States and in Europe. This is, you see, I begin with the Tian clan usurping power in Qi, 481 BC. You can see the Tian clan. I gave you the symbol for the Tian clan. This is them taking power in Qi. This is from a television series that aired in the People's Republic of China. And they're one of many, many, many mini-series, long docudramas that outline the events of the Warring States. Confucius, I begin, and I know Susan's gonna ask me about this in our discussion. Confucius is a very seminal figure in this drama. I sort of juxtapose him with the first emperor, and I talk about the ways in which, one of the ways of understanding the complexity of this period, and I think of it as a revolution. And the complexities of this revolution is that Confucius and the first emperor, trying to decide which of those men is more central to this drama, is virtually impossible. And that gives you a sense of how complex this period is, because as historical actors, they're worlds apart. Right? They're very, very different figures who play very, very different kinds of roles. And yet both of those men were very, very central to all of the developments of the Warring States. Confucius, everyone here in the United States has heard of him. Of course, he's a very, very, well-known figure in China. How do you know he's well-known? Because when they made this most recent biographical movie about him, Zhou got to star as him. He's one of the biggest screen idols in the Chinese-speaking world. So big that people here in the United States have even seen him. He was the star of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, right? Which, and Confucius was an even bigger role for him. So the beginning of the Warring States begins during Confucius's lifetime. If we follow the course of events all the way down to their conclusion, it takes us down to 221 BC, the conquests by the first emperor of Qin, King Yingyang of Qin. And that era corresponds to the first, it falls right between the first and second Punic Wars. And the Punic Wars, so, why are these two periods in Chinese and European history are of comparable importance? The stakes are comparably high, because the Warring States gives us the Qin Empire, which really sort of sets the ball rolling on so many developments that happen in Chinese history down to the 20th century and even to the present day. The Punic Wars give us the Roman Empire, right? And how different would Europe be if the Roman Empire had never really existed? The Roman Empire is really forged in the crucible of the Punic Wars. And again, these events, if we look at the popular imagination, the popular culture of America, of Europe, versus the popular culture of China, we see that there are comparable things going on in relation to this period of time. So with respect to the Punic War, and this is a gag that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, but it's difficult to find. I haven't really been able to find a movie or a television show set during the Punic Wars. So why Hannibal? Because Hannibal is obviously one of the famous Carthaginian generals. He led his elephants across the Alps. So the best I was able to do, Vin Diesel, the movie actor, he had an idea. I don't know if he wrote scripts, but he made this publicity still. He had an idea for, I think, a trio of films dedicated all about the General Hannibal and his struggles against the Roman Empire. Of course, he was going to star as Hannibal. So I don't know if we'll ever get those films. I think that they've been stuck in development for many years. But in terms of the Punic Wars, obviously, If you walk into any bookstore here in the United States, you want to read about the Punic Wars, you have many choices. Adrian Goldsworthy wrote a very popular history of the Punic Wars. And, you know, I'll talk more about this later. Now, with respect to the first emperor and the founding of the Qin dynasty, you know, even more than the Punic Wars, those events are very, very central to the popular imagination of China. The first emperor, people here in the United States tend to be familiar with him because of the fame of his terracotta army that guards his tomb. Really one of the most amazing public works of the ancient world. Hundreds of more than lifestyle statues. If you ever get the chance to visit China, it's really, you must see the terracotta army. It's photos can never do it justice. It gives you a sense of how powerful he was. But his life and his deeds, they provide the material for many, many popular entertainments. I've only chosen them, there are dozens. This film actually aired here in the United States, The Emperor and the Assassin. This was directed by Chen Kai-ge, who also directed Farewell My Concubine and other films that were popular here in the US. This is a television series that aired in the People's Republic of China. This is a television series that aired in Hong Kong, both of which, you know, Jinzhuang, they're both dedicated to the lives of the first emperor of Qin. So, you know, I mean, perhaps I'll close my initial presentation with talking about this concept of the axial age. And this is one of the ways in which I try to sort of explain to American and European audiences why the Warring States is so important, is that so many of the seminal traditions of Chinese civilization are really forged in the crucible of the Warring States, Confucianism, Taoism. And in this respect, what's happening in the Chinese-speaking world is almost eerily paralleled by things that are happening elsewhere. You know, this Swiss philosopher Karl Jaspers noticed that if you look at all of these figures, Lao Tzu, Siddhartha Gautama, Confucius, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, the prophet Amos, the prophet Ezra, the founder of Jainism, the Mahavira, you know, so many different seminal figures of world culture and world religion and philosophy that you can name. They all live within a couple of centuries of each other. So throughout the Eurasian landmass, there's something really interesting going on at around this time. He called it the axial age because, in effect, global culture kind of turns on its axis. And societies all over Eurasia sort of are set running in new directions that remain very enduring down to the present day. So that's one of the reasons why I think, you know, my book is really the first single volume English language history of the Warring States. And, you know, it's kind of a shame, right, that it took until now, right, for such a book to exist. You know, books like it, if you go to China, maybe this is where I'll stop. You know, if you go into an English language bookstore, there are many, many books set during this time period, but recounting events in Europe, right? So they're all taking place during the period that's coincident with the Warring States, but they happen in Greece and Rome and in the Middle East. You know, if you go to China, you find that, of course, there are lots of books about this period in China, but there are also lots of books about Greece and Rome and the Middle East, right? Some of which are translated from English language authors, but many of which are written by Chinese scholars, right? Sun Dao Tian, Ancient Greece History and Heritage, Gu Jun. I first learned of Gu Jun from my friend Zhu Chuxin, right? His writings have been in print now for well over 50 years. This is I think, a 50th anniversary edition of his. This is a Japanese author, Nanami Shiono. Her scholarship on Greece and Rome was originally written in Japanese. Interestingly, it's been translated into both Chinese and English. Well, that's a kind of a strange phenomenon. And, you know, if we look at someone like Yang Quan, whose work was very foundational to my own work, you know, he's a household name in the People's Republic of China. And it's funny because he lived the last decades of his life here in Florida, but no one in the United States has heard of him, right? Which is really, again, a shame because he's really one of I would argue, one of the most important historians working in the field in the world, right? And working on one of the most important periods. So, you know, one thing that if my book achieves that one thing, you know, letting people know who Yang Quan is and that they should take an interest in his work, I'll be very happy about that. So, I mean, I think I'll stop there and hand the program back over to Yuqing Feng.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction. I really think, you know, for a lot of Chinese, this is a well-known timeline, but I think it's really helpful to everyone to know the basic timeline. But here, some question is like, you choose, in your book, you choose the Sandalwood Terrace Code and assassination of the Duke of Qi in BC 481 as a starting point. So why do you think this event is so important? And do you think this event revealed the transformation of the Zhou War and the birth of Warring States area?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, many people have asked me that. You know, yeah. Why start in 481? I have to first confess, I'm not the first one to propose. You know, one thing is that these periodizations, the Zhou dynasty, and then dividing the Zhou dynasty into the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou, and then further subdividing the Eastern Zhou into the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States. Chinese historians started doing that 2,000 years ago, right? So, you know, back during the Han Dynasty, people talked about the Spring and Autumn and the Warring States period. But, you know, it's only really recently, you know, in later centuries that people began to think, well, what exact moment separates the Spring and Autumn period from the Warring States period? And of course, for me, if I want to write a sort of a conventional history, so I followed the historian Liu Zhuqian, who's a northern Song literati. He proposed that really this coup in Qi should be considered the beginning of the Warring States. And I think he got it right. You know, the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period, they denote different periods of decline. You know, the Zhou kings, the authority of the Zhou kings was already waning during the Spring and Autumn period. It was gradually declining. The violence between the regional lords was getting worse and worse. You know, the Warring States period is the period where things get, you know, so far out of control that eventually the 7 most powerful, really more than them, the 9 most powerful regional lords begin calling themselves kings, right? And operating as fully sovereign, fully autonomous, and virtually ignoring the authority of the Zhou kings. But, you know, everyone agrees that's not really the point at which the Warring States begins. It's somewhere between those two. And for me, the coup in Qi is an important watershed. Because what happens with the coup in Qi, the coup in Qi in many respects was similar to other events that had happened in Qi and in other states. But the two things that distinguish that event, one is the involvement of Confucius and his disciples, right? The reason that the coup in Qi happens is because one of Confucius's disciples, who we know as Zhou, he's appointed co-prime minister along with this man Tian Chang. And Tian Chang is undoubtedly the most powerful aristocrat in Qi. He's a member of an ancient household who can trace its lineage back to the ancient sage kings. Zhou, we don't really know who he is, but in the terms of the time, we know he was nobody.
Yes.
And he's made co-prime minister.
Just because of his close relationship with the Duke.
because of his close relationship with the Duke, and because the Duke was persuaded, that Zhou was very learned, because he had studied with Confucius, who's very wise. And so Zhou said, well, you are going to hold equivalent authority to Tian Chang. And that contest becomes very typical, right? That contest between hereditary authority and earned authority based on merit, is a conflict that drives the politics of the rest of the warring states.
But why make this code is different from the regular aristocratic power struggle?
That's an excellent question. I mean, I think that this contest between merit and hereditary authority is one thing, because other coups didn't really involve that. But the other thing that's different is that Tian Chang wins. Spoiler alert, right? That's what happens in chapter 1 of the book. But in winning, because he understands that there has been this very fundamental challenge to his own position and the position of his entire class, really, he begins reorganizing the state of Qi in a way that will guarantee that he can hold on to power. And he comes out of this coup in control of half of the arable land of Qi, which means that he has more wealth at his disposal than virtually anyone else has ever had.
But also because he killed the Duke.
Well, killing the Duke was not rare, right?
Okay.
In other coups, in other words, if all he had done was kill the Duke and put one of the Duke's younger sons on the throne, which is what he does, that had happened many times over the course of the spring and autumn period. But the fact that he insists, in the wake of killing the Duke, he consolidates control over half of the land of Qi. It gives him control of wealth. That it makes him a kind of power broker that the Zhou world had never really seen.
But Confucius, when he heard the code, he is extremely angry, and he thinks really the world collapsed.
I think that even if Tian Chang had not sort of consolidated all of this wealth in his hands, Confucius probably would have felt similarly. For him, it was a simple case. I mean, one suspects that part of the reason he was so moved and dejected and heartbroken is because this took the life of his disciple, right?
Oh yeah, of course.
So,
But not his favorite one.
No. I mean, that's sort of another question.
Yeah.
In the Analects, Zhou is, without a doubt, the worst of Confucius's disciples, right? He's lazy and he sleeps during the day. But one suspects that that's creative editing after the fact. Confucius, I think that at the time, Confucius was very proud of Zhou and very happy because Zhou's elevation to being the prime minister of this very powerful state, that was one of the clearest enactments of Confucius's ideas.
Yes.
That Confucius witnessed in his own lifetime. So I think part of his response is he's responding to that, the fact that, according to him, this was the way. This was the Tao, right? This is how things should happen.
Yes.
And the fact that it had been undermined this way was terrible.
It's supposed to happen is that Zhou was not got this by birth, by blood. He was not a noble person, accurate. He was not born with high prestige. He learned through from Confucius, and then he climbed the way to be the co-prime minister. This just proved Confucius' theory that other than your birth, right, your blood, you have another way to earn your status in the society.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yeah, that's entirely right. And from Confucius's perspective, the coup on the face of it was wrong because Tian Chang, as much as he was an ancient, he was a highborn aristocrat from an ancient house. The Duke that he killed was an even more highborn aristocrat from an even more ancient house, which had very sacred, prerogatives within the state of Qi. And so, this was a terrible sin that Tian Chong had committed by killing his dupe. And what made it even worse, from Confucius's perspective, that, Confucius insisted that someone who was born into the position of the Duke of Qi, he had the power and he had the authority to choose someone of learning and wisdom and raise them up high. And so here was the first time that someone born into that position had actually done the right thing. And so to let it pass like this, where, well, that's his reward for having done the right thing, he's murdered, Confucius, I don't think, he just couldn't live with that, right? He didn't want that to be what the upshot of that was.
Yeah, that's interesting. That image of Confucius, it's kind of an innovator, right? Yeah, because before him, it's always like how your position in the society was decided by which family you were born from. If you're born in a high blood family, noble family, But Confucius, think you can learn your way to that. That's very innovative. But actually, that image is contradicted to a lot of Chinese thinking about Confucius. Confucius, most of us think is a very conservative figure, Why he always say, the warring states is 礼崩乐坏, means the collapse of all the social norms, He insists we should have a society that everyone has their own, status, to rule the society. A ruler act as a ruler, like a minister act as a minister, father as a father, son as son. In Chinese was 君君臣臣父父子子. So everyone has a position in the society. That's what we all very familiar with Confucius. But what you said, is that he mentioned that, not only the society, one hand we should do all this 君君臣臣父父子子, with everyone has their own responsibility and role in the society. But on the other hand, he proposed that, someone who was born in a low status can learn from him and then become a very a high, go to a nobility, it's like he believed that actually the class can move a little bit, can move forward. That's, how did you, balance these two burdens of Confucius?
Well, I mean, to me, one has to understand both of these dimensions of Confucius in order to really make sense of his historical role.
Yeah.
Right? And of course, like most very influential historical figures, Confucius is a very complicated figure, and he's been interpreted in many different ways. And there's some merit to the case that he's conservative. There are certainly conservative dimensions of his thinking. But you really can't get away. The sources really they don't allow you to sort of write him off as unreconstructedly conservative. Because if you really look carefully at the facts we know of his life, and what we can reconstruct of his teachings, he really is proposing very, very radical forms of social mobility.
Yes.
And, I'm not the first person to say this. Zhou wrote this monograph back in the 1960s, Ancient China in Transition, where, he argued, and I would agree, that one of the hallmarks of the warring states, it's an era of rising social mobility. That as the era progresses, you see more and more people rising from lower positions in society and scaling unimaginable heights of wealth and power. And that, in a sense, I think begins with Confucius. Confucius is one of the first people who's arguing very robustly that this is one of the ways we have to change society if we're going to escape the crisis of the sort of the disintegration of the Zhou social order.
That's very interesting. There is another point in your book, surprised me about Confucius. In your book, you wrote that Confucius, he insisted that all people should perform the exact role of responsibility in the society, like I just mentioned, 君君臣臣父父子子, is a way that is called this norm is a way to help the society to maintain the social order. It's not that if we have this system, everyone should behave in a certain way. So no country, so we don't need everyone, the most strong person, strong power, have the final say. So all the society can only be arranged by power. Who has the biggest power? It's like, the world will ruled by the fist. But Confucius think, with this system, this social norm, the society can maintain, can organize in a certain way, not the most powerful, have the final say.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And this makes Confucius very, very much parallel to people like Socrates and the Shakyamuni Buddha and others who were roughly contemporary with him, who were sort of struggling with the same problem, right? How do we escape from the trap of living in a world where might makes right?
Yes.
And I think that's very much sort of the problem at the center of all of Confucius's.
But for me, it's a little confusing because, growing up in modern China, we all think that Confucius, play a larger role for China's, the very historical tragedy, even today for the character of a lot of Chinese, like if this all the 君君臣臣父父子子 make everyone perform a certain role in the society. So people, make Chinese character a little bit obedient and, not innovative. It's like people most focus on what role you should play in the society, but not becoming yourself. And a lot of people, especially people in the 1941, when all the foreign powers invade China and all the intellectuals in China, start to think what's wrong with our culture, what's wrong with Chinese people, why we are not a brave nation, why we are so left behind. A lot of people point to Confucius, this social norm to prevent Chinese people from innovating, from being yourself, from being brave.
What you say is true. I mean, in other words, you're talking about the 20th century was a rough century for Confucius.
Yes.
Beginning really with the new culture movement.
Yeah.
With people like Chen Duxiu and
Yeah.
look, their critique of Confucius, Chen Duxiu is much smarter than I am. I'm not going to, but their critique of Confucius had merit. What I'll say is this, right? Is if Confucius inhibited the dynamism of Chinese society, it kicked in pretty late, because China is one of the most dynamic societies in the world, really, and remains one of the most dynamic societies in the world. I think people, Chen Duxiu and Hu Shi and Yu Shun and the authors of the New Culture movement, they were living through a kind of a crisis, right? They were living through an era of crisis, kind of like the one Confucius himself confronted.
Yes.
And they were offering very robust and sort of provocative critiques. But I don't know that their critiques, as germane as they were to the time in which they lived, I don't know that they really explain all of Chinese history.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of Confucius.
That's what that's a little bit puzzled me when I read the book. But that really makes me rethink what I am used to think about Confucius. It really make me think again what Confucius, really mean to China, to Chinese culture. Yeah. And let's go back to the warring states. So in your book, you repeatedly said, the inherited status with the emerging source of legitimacy. Like, so what makes you legitimate to rule is because of you were born this way, or is because you have the old new wealth, military power, and learning, honor, and courage. So in your view, what was replacing the birth status in the warring states?
Well, there was a great debate happening between different centers of power and different centers, different ideas. Certainly, service to the state. The state itself. What the state meant was being reimagined. What is the state? Who does the state serve? Who controls the state? Who owns the state? Right? And so service to the state was one way of sort of measuring people's status, learning, morality. You have thinkers like Zhuangzi and whoever wrote the Lao Tzu who say, well, status is an illusion, but
yes.
To the extent that we should care about status at all, it has to do with how deeply in touch you are with the ground of the cosmos. And there's all sorts of different ways. But I think an emerging consensus over the course of the warring states is that whatever status is, it really can't be reduced to birth. Right?
Yes.
That really is sort of the consensus that emerges out of the warring states, which is really remarkable because this distinguishes China from much of the rest of the world for the next couple of millennia, right? China is very firmly under the control of a hereditary aristocracy when the warring states begin. And the hereditary aristocracy remains in control of society all the way down to the end and beyond. But with the collapse of the Qin dynasty and the founding of the Han, that hereditary aristocracy, in effect, is gone. And they never really come back. Right? There are other sort of aristocratic groups that form in Chinese society in later eras, but nothing with the kind of robust control and robust hereditary privileges of the warring states aristocracy. And groups like the warring states aristocracy exist in places like Japan and Korea and Europe and the Middle East, all the way down to the 20th century. And the liberation of Chinese society from that hereditary aristocracy, it sets loose energies, right, that really transform not just China but the world, right? And again, I would give Confucius some of the credit for that.
But there is another argument that China is ending the mature too early, like in BC 221 when Emperor Qin Shi Huang ruled the country.
He unifies the country in 221.
221, yeah, 221 BCE. By then China ends the warring states and entered the Da Yitong, the emperor. All the China became one country. Sure, it gave China 1,000 years prosperity, but by the 19th century, people argue that that's one of the reasons that Chinese society matured too early, and for the only one, the big country, stop from competition, innovation, and democracy. That's also people argue that China become, mature too early, and that's also, people think that way too.
No, I know, and I've read scholarship to that effect. And these debates, they will continue, and they're provocative and they're intriguing. One of the reasons I think the warring states is so interesting to look at, this idea that China unified too early, a lot of that results from, people are following European theorists like Hegel or Marx, who want to propose that, human history should unfold according to certain principles, right? They give us these very elaborate schemes about how history should unfold. And one of the problems with all of those theories is that China never fits, right? If you look at Chinese history, it never quite fits Hegel's scheme or Marx's scheme. And so, if we look at the warring states and we appreciate what's happening in Chinese society, then I think one of the possibilities we should be open to is, maybe there is no one universal pattern for human history.
Of course.
Right? Maybe different human societies develop in different ways.
Yeah.
And maybe there's nothing wrong with that. Right? This idea that if you didn't evolve the way things unfolded in Europe, there's something wrong. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. Right?
Okay. Yeah. No, I did not argue that society, the different countries should follow the same pattern. I just say that it's a fact, not fact, it's opinion that because Chinese society matured a bit way early, that it did not have this kind of competition between inner powers, and then it's not like I said Chinese history should follow the pattern.
I wasn't accusing you of but what I would say is that look, we can't know if China hadn't unified as early as it did, would there have been more technology and more technological power in China in the 19th and 20th century? Maybe there would have been less.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we don't really know.
We don't know.
And the thing is that if you look at China today, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you describe the spring and autumn period and early warring states period, not history, as violent and unstable. But this is one of the greatest area of intellectual creative in Chinese history. It's very, very interesting time. Part of what is often, you also mentioned the Axial Age. So do you see the rise of Confucius, not only Confucius, but also Mozi and Taoism and legalism, is kind of the society's elites are trying to figure out how to respond to the political breakdown, how to respond to the collapse of the old order?
I think that's exactly what's happening. I mean, the metaphor that I very often use in describing the warring states to audiences here in the United States is, the Zhou dynasty that contains most of the warring states, at its foundations, it was a very, very successful, social formation. The Zhou dynasty expanded, it grew in wealth, it grew in power, but over the course of the spring and autumn period and down into the warring states, all of the cultural traditions, social norms of the Zhou began to break down. They began to catastrophically collapse. So that if you look at people like Mozi and Confucius and Zhuangzi and all of the great thinkers of the warring states, I think we can compare them to people who are in a boat on the ocean, which is disintegrating, and they're trying to rebuild the boat, in the middle of the ocean, That's in effect what the drama of the warring states is like. And you see similar dramas going on in other societies at around the same time. It's what's happening in Periclean Athens and Socratic Athens. It's what's happening in northern India during the life of the Buddha,
In other ways, they try to redefine the norms.
Yeah, they're trying to rebuild civilization, Rebuild a sense of, how we understand human society and what its fundamental purposes and structures should be.
Yeah, and since we're talking about the warring states, by definition, we'll think it's a lot of war going on, right? Yeah, but when you think of if a lot of war going on, you will think the society is chaos, and it's like, what do you think about war? But in general sense, war will bring chaos, disruption to the society. People will suffer a lot. But actually, this time period is economic expansion. Its productive growth increased a lot. And part of the reason becoming warring states is because the wealth increased. So how do we view that kind of area? On the one hand, we have this economic expansion, productive growth, and we have this marvelous intellectual creativity. And on the other hand, it's still a lot of war going on. It definitely causes suffering, chaos. How to see this how to give us a kind of clear view of this area.
Well, I think to get a clear view of it, one would have to write a book that was about 500 and, that's, in effect, you're sort of describing the problem that I'm wrestling with over the course of the book. Someone, and forgive me for answering by reference to an anecdote, but I got into a fight with someone over Twitter, not a fight really, but a discussion, where he referred me to an Israeli scholar who said, you know, if we look at the ancient world, we know that armies were very small. So these reports of armies of more than 100,000 soldiers during the Warring States couldn't possibly be true. And I said, well, you know, and it's true, that Israeli scholar really wasn't looking at the evidence of what's going on in China. And you're right, what's going on in China is that there's all sorts of technologies that are making the society much more prosperous. Iron technology, new forms of agriculture, new forms of manufacturing technology. And what's happening is that, you know, in general, the evolution of a human society is driven by two forces, right? Competition and cooperation. And, you know, if I'm gonna really overgeneralize, which I have to, right? You know, what's happening in the Warring States is that all of the traditions that had helped foster cooperation during the Zhou dynasty are kind of in collapse, right? Conflict, it's very difficult to predict when conflict is gonna happen, how long it's gonna last, how destructive it's going to become. And so that drives competition. And that competition drives increasing wealth and increasing technology. But that in and of itself becomes a trap, right? You know, why were these great kingdoms of the Warring States able to field these enormous armies, you know, armed with really powerful technology? It's not just that they had hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but these are hundreds of thousands of soldiers armed with crossbows. Crossbows wouldn't be invented in Europe, you know, for another 1,500 years after the Warring States, right? And it's you know, the crossbow is a very labor-intensive technology. You need a big industrial complex behind it to arm thousands of soldiers with crossbows. Well, you can do that because you have these burgeoning trade networks, because commerce is extending across thousands of miles and goods and services are moving between these states, right? All of this wealth vastly increasing the productivity of this society, which makes it possible to field these enormous armies. But one of the reasons that you have to field those enormous armies is because if you've got a trade network that extends that far, well, you'd better have a big army to protect it, right? So the competition sort of drives these societies to create these amazing and enormous structures of power. But then the challenge becomes, well, how do we get to the point where we have this technology, but we don't need to use it, right? And that's a very difficult trap to escape.
Great, thank you so much. Let's give Professor a big round of applause. Now open the question.
Sir.
Okay, so given your concentration in your talk, and you originally said you wanted to call some kind of warring state, why not the 100 contending schools? Because from the discussion, it seems to be more about the ideas. And you know, we barely, let's not forget, it's not mentioned here, but it's legalism, Fajia, that unifies China under the Qin. It's not Confucianism. You know, they're the ones who initially reorganized society under these strict mobilization techniques and stuff, and their regulations. They're the ones that have to successfully use all this to. It's not their virtue that they mobilize, it's their forces of bureaucracy that they were successful. And so why not mention any of the others?
Okay, that's a good question. I think one of the things, what drew me into the study of the Warring States, I love the study of early Chinese intellectual history. So what drew me to the history of this period was reading texts like the Lunyu and the Zhuangzi and the Dao De Jing and the Hanfeizi and the Shangjun Shu. And so, one of the things that I hope this book will be useful for is as a kind of textbook that can provide students who are interested in that intellectual history with a background history, that they'll know the social and political and cultural history that forms the context in which all of these great, masterpieces of Chinese thought were composed. The Art of War by Master Sun. And I discuss all of them in the context of the book. And I discuss not only just their existence, but I talk about the ideas that are articulated in all of these texts. Why not call this book The 100 Schools? I think that, a focus just on the 100 schools in the abstract has perhaps distorted the way people here in America understand them, right? If all you do is look at the writings of these thinkers in isolation, it becomes easy to sort of exoticize them, right? Ooh, the Zhuangzi, he's so mystical, or Han Feizi, he's so cruel, but when you begin to situate these texts and the people who created them in the historical context in which they lived, you understand that they were responding to concrete crises, right? And I think it gives us a better understanding of who they were as human beings, of what their role was in a kind of a human society. So, I hope that people who are interested in the 100 schools will profit from reading the book. But that's one of my objects in writing the book, was to provide context so that these ideas won't be abstracted. I think I know that the view that you articulate is a common one. Oh, well, it's the legalists who unified China. Read the book, you'll see I make an argument that no, that's not really the case.
Yeah, well,
That it's more complicated than that.
I agree it's more complicated.
Okay, well then we've reached a point of harmony.
I have a question about the tail end, about the Qin. Like, looking at a map of the Warring States period, you see Chinese civilization is mostly focused in northern China, but when you look at a map of the Qin and then a little bit later to Han, suddenly they're controlling southern China, suddenly they're controlling the Gansu Basin. How did that happen? That was a few centuries ago. It was just foreign barbarians that were rolling in, that they were getting influenced and being influenced by, and then soon afterwards they were able to rapidly control this region for essentially the rest of Chinese history.
The whole question of southern China is one of the most fascinating dimensions of this history. And you're right, if you go to the People's Republic of China today, about 6/10 of China's population, right, the largest concentration of Chinese-speaking people in the world, lives south of the Yangtze River, right? If you look back during the Warring States, that was not true, right? 4/5 of Chinese-speaking people lived on the Yellow River Plain, right? And the further south, as you went south from the Yangtze River, you encountered fewer and fewer people who would have spoken any kind of language ancestral to Chinese. If you went into areas like Zhejiang or Guangzhou today, those places were inhabited effectively by non-Chinese people. Part of the very dramatic history of the Warring States, I begin talking about this in chapter 2, and it's sort of a theme that continues through the rest of the text, is that the part of the history of the Warring States is the gradual sort of incorporation of these southern societies into the larger political and social fabric of the Zhou and the emerging Qin world. Some of that happens by violence, some of it's through conquest, some of it happens through sort of voluntary, I don't want to call it assimilation, but you have societies in the vicinity of like Lake Tai, these kingdoms of Wu and Yue, which voluntarily elect to sort of join the Zhou world and begin to sort of compete with other states in the Zhou world as sort of political actors. So, it's a fascinating history, and of course, you know, the path that leads us to the point we're at now, where 6/10 of the people of the People's Republic of China live in southern China, that begins in the Warring States. But it takes a long time. That demographic switch doesn't really happen until the Song Dynasty.
Yes, until
It's not-
1,000 years later.
Yeah, it's
After-
more than 1,000.
More than
years
1,000
later.
after Warring States. Like in Tang Dynasty, you know, when the famous poets, you know, were sentenced to jail, you know, they kind of would go.
They were all sent to the south where nobody
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah.
Andy, thank you so much for such an insightful talk. I suspect you get this question quite a bit during your talks. What kind of a continuity or connection do you see between how the Asian China's world's view of 天下, you know, versus how China sees its role in today's world?
That's an excellent question. You know, some of the people at the press, they wanted my subtitle to be something like China's dream of world hegemony or something like that. You know. And you know, I think that this concept of Tianxia, I think it's misunderstood, right? You know, the idea of Tianxia was, well, how do we achieve harmony and unity out of this situation of fragmentation and conflict, right? And you know, that's a kind of a question that has occupied Chinese intellectuals for all of Chinese history, right? And you know, figures like Confucius and Han Feizi during the Warring States had one approach to that problem, which was very much rooted in the context of their time. If you turn the clock forward and you come to the end of the 19th century to 1893, 1898, Kang Youwei, right, has a completely different understanding of what Tianxia means and how we, you know, he would have sworn up and down that, oh, his understanding of Tianxia is the same as Confucius, but it's very different, right? And he's working with that concept to sort of try to understand how we can restore harmony to China and the rest of the world in this new world, this new multipolar world of multiple states and multiple empires, right? Turn the clock forward again to, you know, the 21st century, and you've got a Chinese intellectual like Liu Cixin, right? For him, Tianxia, it isn't even confined to the earth, right? It's the entire galaxy, right? And he's talking about societies that span the cosmos, right? But the problem remains the same, right? How do we restore harmony to a multipolar, you know, society, a multipolar existence? And you know, the answers are all sort of are diverse. They're all contingent on specific contexts. But I would say that in effect, all of those people are working off of traditions that begin in the Warring States. So that's a plug for my book.
Please.
Hey, thanks for giving such a good talk. When I was reading the book, I think something I found really bizarre was these people like Tian Wen and Zhang Yi, who are like all over the place, and like they're prime minister of everywhere, and made me feel like I'm importing, you know, modern conceptions of statehood, loyalty, that kind of stuff, to, you know, a very foreign world. And I guess my question is, like, when you were reading these primary sources and trying to inhabit, you know, live in these foreign worlds, like, what is that experience like, and were there like any other things that you felt were bizarre or foreign when you were, you know, reading through these primary sources?
That's an excellent question. you know, I think your question and your impressions sort of, they crystallize both the frustration and the wonder of doing history, right? This is why historians love doing history, but this is what confounds us too, right? Is that when you're looking at, you know, is it Charles Santayana? I'm forgetting the quote. The past is a foreign country, right? And if you go far enough into the past, things get very strange, right? And yes, I mean, when you're looking at someone like Zhang Yi or Tianwen, you know, this episode where Tianwen goes from being the prime minister of Qin to being the prime minister of Qi, that's just weird. And it's so weird that one suspects it's fiction, but Li Feng, the professor at Columbia, told me that they've discovered some writings in one of the tombs in Qin that corroborates that this actually happened, right? And to me, one of the things that shows is that this is a sign of just how strange things had gotten for the people of that time, right? How do we get to a place where we can cooperate? How do we arrest these waves of competition, these waves of strife? And you know that people are desperate when one of the solutions they land on is, all right, let's trade prime ministers. Give me your prime minister, I'll make him my prime minister, then we'll be okay, right? And so to me, that's just, but that's also a sign of how bold these people were. You know, how bold does it take to experiment in that? And that's one of the things that's just so exciting about looking at the history of this period.
Okay, we can have one more question, please.
How much does the discovery of all these bamboo slips, Mao Wangdui, how much of that is changing your perspective? I mean, you have basically the corpus written down in under Kangxi, that whole period, all the history's done, that's what everyone's working with. Then you got Mao Wangdui, every year they're digging up another tomb, another group of bamboo slips. How does that affect your scholarship and your attitudes?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and the archaeology has really revolutionized the understanding of people who are looking at this period. I'll give you an example. You know, I'm sort of cribbing this idea from my friend who teaches at Penn, Paul Golden. I'm trying to get away from using this term legalist. You know, legalism is kind of is a bibliographical category that imperial era scholars come up with. And you know, what we're finding from looking at these manuscripts that come out of tombs like Mao Wangdui or Guodian was that the boundaries between these schools were very fluid. That the marketplace of ideas was very, very dynamic. People were poaching material from one another. And that this was a very sort of materially sort of embedded, fractious, contentious array, you know, arena of intellectual debate. So, you know, I think that the discovery of these archaeologically recovered manuscripts is very rapidly changing the way that we think about, particularly the intellectual and cultural history of this period. And I think that's a process that's ongoing and will continue.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thank you so much.